Welcome to the Wildy West, a podcast dedicated to being a voice for wild horses. My name is Chase McGoran, and I will be your host. Let's save these horses together. All I ask you to do is listen. Welcome back to the second half of my interview with Dr. Claudia Notzke, a wild horse expert, researcher, geographer, and professor emerita at the University of Lethbridge. She is a lifelong equestrian and outdoors enthusiast. Horses, wild and tame, have always been part of her life. For her research program entitled The Wild/Feral Horse in North America, Wildlife, Cultural Heritage, or Ecological Intruder, Claudia traveled through BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montana, Wyoming, and North and South Dakota. Her research on wild horse populations has also taken her to Namibia, Mongolia, Germany, and Sable Island in Nova Scotia. She has numerous research publications about wild horses and continues to be a tireless Wildy advocate in the fight to protect these magnificent horses and their right to remain living free on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. Stay tuned after the interview for a story Dr. Claudia sent to us about her first experience with wild horses and how she fell in love with them. Read by Naomi Lucille. If you missed part one, I would highly recommend going back and watching that one first, as it will give you some much needed context. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's how they were able to take over so much of the world. Yeah. The Alberta government is planning to cull 30 horses and dart 90 mares with contraception in the Elbow and Clearwater zones this winter. If they go ahead with those plans, what do you think the effects will be on the population of horses, on that population?
Yeah. It's going to be extremely negative. Overall, we are already dealing with a low population. Now I'm talking about the 1,500 populating the whole of the eastern slope. And this low population is, well, it's at best static, it's at worst declining. And furthermore, we have a very low foal survival rate. We don't have a systematic study of foal survival like recruitment from baby to yearling, but anecdotal evidence as well as, and particularly citizen science, has really convincingly shown that in all likelihood that survival rate is no higher than 10 or 15%. And under these circumstances, the very idea of rendering 90 mares infertile over several years is just totally ludicrous. And for me personally, it's also an indicator of an effort to basically manage these horses out of existence. There is no other way of putting it. Then the next thing, removing 30 stallions, another real blow to the population, not to mention the impact on these individuals, because what do you do with 30 stallions? They may not be suitable for domestic life. It's easier when you remove babies or rescue babies, as we have seen on many occasions, but if you take a mature stallion and with the hope of turning them into a riding horse or domestic horse, sometimes it works, but it can be very, very problematic. And we have a pretty good idea of where they go if things don't work out for them. And finally, and furthermore, we also have to think about the social impact on equine society. We're dealing with elders. We are dealing with the leaders. We are dealing with families. We are dealing with bonded pairs. We are dealing with friends, because people usually don't recognize the complexity of equine society. And if you totally remove individuals from those populations, the social impact is just as strong as the physical impact. And then looking at those two zones, the Clearwater zone borders on the Sundre zone. And so we have movement of horses between those zones. But Clearwater has also, particularly over this year, been subject to illegal removals. and poaching of wild horses, which has been another blow to the population level. And furthermore, there is also very legitimate concern about the accuracy of counts, particularly on the border of those two zones, because there has been double counting, counting over several days, and we have already proven that there were serious issues with horse counts in the Clearwater zone, and these issues are going to continue.
The battery. It says battery saver.
Oh, okay. Let me plug that in. Sorry. Now, without further ado, I present part 2 of the Wildy West interview with Dr. Claudia Notzke. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay, we can back there.
Well, the next zone, the elbow zone. The elbow equine management zone is separate from the northern zones, so there's no exchange of horse populations. And it's also a small zone with a very low level of population. So even as they stand right now, the size of the population is not sufficient to guarantee genetic viability in the long run. So they are already at risk, and now they're going to be further depopulated, which is a huge issue, obviously, and again indicative of, in all likelihood, the zone will disappear, if they continue with this type of management, in quotation marks. And then on top of everything else, they also plan to, or proposes to use an experimental and unapproved Spayvac vaccine, which, at least in this country, is only admissible for research and experimentation and not for management. And we know perfectly well what is going on here. This is management. This is a reduction, a very focused reduction of equine populations.
Okay. That's...
It sucks.
That makes me upset.
It sucks. Yeah. Really, it sucks big time.
I'm laughing, but I'm genuinely quite upset because...
I don't blame you.
Yeah, thank you. Why should people, including non-horse lovers, people more like me, I love horses, I grew up on a horse farm, but they're not part of my everyday. So obviously I care, but why should people people care?
Yeah, why indeed? Well, you can't tell people to care. They either do or they don't. Personally, I don't relate to animals as resources, but since it's a universally understood term, I might as well talk about horses as a resource, wild horses as a resource. We have already established that they're an ecological resource. We have discussed how horses are very essential players in the Eastern Slopes ecosystem, where they continue to fill a niche that has existed for them since time immemorial. So that's already an established fact. They're also a genetic resource. We already talked about the genetic test results, where we see in wild horses the traces of extinct colonial Spanish bloodlines, which is very important. We have also discussed close connection with the Canadian horse, which is a rare breed. They're very hard to find. And furthermore, even the heavy horses that were introduced just over a century ago, they are quite often rare, heavy breeds in Europe, which are hard to find. And overall, we can say that our wild horses in particular, they exhibit a degree of a genetic diversity and also natural smarts that has become sadly absent in many of our modern horse breeds. So they definitely constitute a treasure trove of genetics for the Canadian horse industry. And yet another type of resource, horses constitute a cultural resource. And again, I've hinted at that. Wild horses are a very iconic and charismatic animal. They elicit strong reactions from people. And certainly in Alberta, their roots reach back long before the first colonists came, But after that, their history also places them side by side with people who shaped Alberta and turned it in what it is today. And when we look at different types of societies, certainly horses, including wild horses, have enriched First Nations lives immeasurably. First, wild horses from the Eastern Plains were also part of those horses who carried the Northwest Mounted Police on their march west. There were wild horses among them. Wild horses, and particularly due to their resistance to diseases, were also very important by working side by side with early colonists and early pioneers. Finally, wild horses have also paid the ultimate price on battlefields. Just in the past century, thousands and thousands were transported to the battlefields during the Boer War in South Africa, during the First World War, and they never return. So they definitely have a very important role to play in Albertans history. And furthermore, they inspire people in many ways. A lot of people view them as a symbol of freedom. And wild horses basically have inspired people from all over the world, even people who may never view a wild horse. They are inspired by the very existence of horses living like horses, living self-determined lives, which is quite a foreign concept to a lot of horse people indeed. And this cultural resource also translates into an economic resource when we talk about tourism, for example. I always think wild horses, or any other animal for that matter, they should not have to pay their own way. But given half a chance, they may do just that, and particularly with regard to wild horse-based tourism. Tourism based on wild horses is quite widespread all over the world, actually. Canada is one of the rare countries that has never marketed or tried to capitalize on wild horses as a tourism attraction, because wild horse tourism attractions are found in many European countries. They are certainly found in Namibia, in Mongolia, also in the western United States, and many herd management areas, wild horse ranges, sanctuaries. And when I did some tourism research in 2008, I certainly looked into that in the United States as well as in Canada. And in the United States, where there were successful tourism ventures, people registered a very high degree of satisfaction. They really enjoyed their experience, and it was not an experience that was necessarily invasive into a wild horse society. In Western Canada, we do not really find situations where wild horses are acknowledged as a tourism attraction, even though in more recent years some individuals have engaged in that, like Sandy and Deborah Garside. But overall, the potential of wild horses is pretty much ignored. And that was one of the reasons why I found it quite interesting to look into whether local tourists in locations adjoining wild horse ranges in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, whether they would be interested in a facilitated wild horse experience, not just driving around and hoping to see a horse, which can be a little frustrating if you don't know where you're going. And I did a questionnaire survey with self-addressed questionnaires being offered in visitor centers and then being mailed to me. And it was really interesting and revealing that a lot of people visiting Sundre and Olds and also Lloydminster in Saskatchewan, they were very, very interested in a facilitated wild horse experience. And they would also spend an extra day or two, i.e. spending money, which is what people care about, if there was such a possibility available. Now, I have a very, I'm ambivalent about tourism because it can take on a life of its own if it's poorly managed. But if strategically managed and if effectively controlled, tourism can play a huge role in education and in making wild horses accessible and understandable and valued by a larger portion of the population. So there's definitely an underutilized potential. And in recent years, particularly due to their presence on social media, that interest has multiplied in Canada as well as internationally. And finally, why should we care? If I'm asked that question, I personally always say that we owe it to wild horses, and we owe it to their tremendous role in our culture and in our history to acknowledge them as a biological being in its own right, not just as a servant of man. And I really feel they've earned the right to just be horses. To behave like horses, do what horses do.
Yeah, because I don't think there's one person on this earth that hasn't seen some kind of media with a horse in it, right? I don't think there's one person that doesn't know what a horse is, right? I'd be shocked.
Yeah.
And I think I agree. It's really important to have a space where they can be themselves, because there really is something magical,
of course,
about seeing a herd of completely wild, untouched horses.
And the good thing was, I mean, as I said, I'm ambivalent about tourism, but I'm pro-tourism if it's done right and if it contributes to conservation of nature or culture or particular species. Mm-hmm. It was really interesting to see and to hear people's reactions. And when you research wildlife tourism, it was very close to people's fascination about dolphins. Mm-hmm. You know, those were basically the closest relationship in just the magic that people experience when they watch these animals. And it was also good to see, and again, there was a concern that people were not looking for a petting zoo. I mean, they can go anywhere to feed a horse a carrot or stroke a nose, but watching horses just be horses, you know, and that's what appeals to people, thankfully, you know, and that's where the potential would be, and that's why Sandy's work, for example, and also in tourism, not just photography, certainly kind of hits the right spot and does it in the right way, you know, that benefits horses.
Yeah, because before we moved to Alberta, we actually came up as tourists.
Yeah.
And we had no idea that there were wild horses.
Yeah.
We absolutely, like, I can guarantee you, we would have stayed an extra day in Sundre if there had been some form of tourism, right? So, because we came here and
It was very funny when I first came to Canada from Germany and as a young student, and I read in the AMA Book of the Road, there are wild horses near was just some general location. There was, and right away I jumped in my little orange Datsun and spent hours and hours and days driving hundreds of miles, not seeing a single horse's tail. Yeah. And then they were out of the picture for a while, and then eventually, you know, I educated myself.
And you were able to.
Was more successful, and they became a big part of my life. So.
Yeah, they're really just wonderful creatures. And then I have one last question here for you. If someone wanted to read one of your numerous publications on the subject of horses, where would you be able to find one of those? Would you just Google it, or?
Yeah, probably you could, but I have a lot of academic publications, which is a whole different kettle of fish. And then I also have publication. I've written a primer for the general public and also for to help some politicians who wanted to help us until they discovered this was a really hot potato. But I do have, I don't know that my publications are available on the web, but I certainly can make the primer maybe. I'm not sure. I also wrote an article for a naturalist magazine. But again, I don't think it would be available on the web. So
okay, so it's one of those things where if you're in school or something, you can probably find it through your library. Or...
Oh yeah, just Google my name probably, and you could find it in any research database.
Perfect. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. That's all the questions I have.
You also wanted to know how listeners can help.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, because I changed the wording to how. What can we do to help?
Yeah, yeah.
Just to. Oh, did I skip that question? I'm sorry.
It was the last one.
That is the last one. What can we do to help? Sorry.
Yeah, it's well, first and foremost, educate yourself. That's a huge thing. Don't believe everything you're told, particularly by government. Don't be apathetic. Speak up for those without a voice. And that can be done in many different ways, actually. It very much depends on your talents. It very much depends on your background, on your skills, but also on what you're comfortable with. Not everybody is comfortable with just any kind of actions or activities. And that's why it really helps to inform yourself about organizations, non-governmental organizations such as HORSE or ZooCheck, who already have established campaigns and successful campaigns, who have a track record in that particular field, and take their cue as to what you can do in terms of letter writing, in terms of petitions, in terms of direct actions, whatever you're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And so there are many ways that you can help. It's kind of funny. I always used to tell my students, believe in the power of one, because that's always something you can do, as long as you care.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, Sandy actually said something similar. Doesn't matter how small you think your voice is, it really isn't, right? Your voice has a lot more weight than you really think it does.
And it's also important to realize you don't have to be a wild horse expert or a horse expert, period, or even being acquainted with horses. A lot of time, I mean, right now, just tech savvy, for example, does a lot for us. You're an excellent example of that. And many other people on our team, they may be scared of horses, and they may not be particularly wild about going out and actually interacting with those horses, but they care. Mm-hmm. And they can help a great deal with things that other team members may not be able to contribute. That what makes a great team. And that also works for the public. No matter what your background is, what your skills are, and even what your personal disposition is towards activism or advocacy, there is a role for you to play.
And even the smallest thing is a step in the right direction, right?
Everything counts.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for
You're
taking time out of your day and letting us use your room here to set up an interview. But thank you so much.
I hope it was what you were looking for.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, yeah. It was.
And now, I am excited to share with you the wonderful story provided by Dr. Claudia Notzke of her first encounter with wild horses. Thank you to Naomi Lucille for reading this for us.
Chasing Redcap, or this wild horse advocate's first encounter with wild horses. I am sometimes asked about my very first encounter with wild horses, and how ironic it is that my first personal meeting occurred while chasing them. I was always fascinated with wild horses, and as a child in Germany, I collected every wild horse book I could get my hands on, while being an avid fan of TV stars Fury. I also loved tame horses. I received my first riding lesson for my 12th birthday and have not been out of a saddle for more than a week ever since, with the exception of some horseless trips. After buying my first vehicle, I was ready to explore the great Canadian wilderness. The AMA book of the road told me that there were wild horses in the Rocky Clearwater Forest Reserve. I drove my little 1972 orange Datsun for many miles and countless hours without spotting a single horse's tail. For the next 4 years, wild horses disappeared from my horizon, but I had wonderful horsey experiences nonetheless. Doing research on the First Nations Reserve, I was gifted a magnificent black Appaloosa, whom we named Winterhawk, by Pawnee Chief Nelson Smalllegs Sr. I rode in Pecani roundups and hung out with free roaming horses on the Stony Nakota Reserve. After completing my PhD in Calgary and not having been able to get a handle on my immigration, I had to return to Germany. There, the walls started closing in quickly, and before deciding to come back to Canada on the basis of a postdoctoral fellowship, I opted for a 6-month tourist visa in 1983, working for room and board on Griffin Valley Ranch. Griffin Valley Ranch was a large horse ranch located west of Cochrane in the Wildcat Hills. While still in Calgary, I had boarded Winterhawk there and also left my vehicle before returning to Germany. The ranch was owned by Harold Griffin, who was in his 70s when I first met him. Harold was a legend in his own time. Short in stature, but with a huge personality. A well-known horseman with a quick temper and a wry sense of humor. He still outrode and outdanced every cowboy on that ranch. We liked each other immediately, and I was soon adopted into the family. During the summer months, the ranch ran a summer camp for Calgary students. While I was working there, with a handful of other ranch hands, both male and female, we started at 6 a.m., catching and feeding around 70 horses before breakfast, then saddling them and teaching kids basic horsemanship, as well as taking them on trail rides in the morning and afternoon. Once the students had left for home, other tasks awaited us, namely starting and training horses, as well as looking after occasional trail riding clients. We often worked 14-hour days, but I was in heaven. I also became the resident horse nurse, doctoring everything from punctured wounds to horrific cougar attacks. There were wild horses in the vicinity of the ranch, and one of them was Redcap. She was a beautiful sorrel pinto with a red cap over her ears. She was one of those rare medicine hat horses considered sacred by many Plains First Nations. She was with 2 companions, one of them a stallion known as the Ridge Runner. He was not popular with ranchers, who accused him of stealing mares. Same old stories then and now. Harold wanted Redcap, and he wanted her badly. I was puzzled by his obsession and asked him why. He was only half joking when he replied that she might spice up his dude string. I thought this preposterous and said so. Then he came out with a true reason. He wanted her for me to break. By then, Harold was rather proud of his bronc buster, which is how he liked to introduce me. I had not busted any broncs or broke any horses, but had gentled and started quite a few under the saddle, including a pony and even a mule. My methods were purely based on intuition and communication. I was to recognize many elements years later once resistance-free training and the various schools of natural horsemanship became fashionable. I had done well in this part of my job, which quickly became my favorite, but all this paled before the fact that I was riding Slippers. Slippers was a 6-year-old gorgeous reddish-colored Appaloosa mare with a blonde mane and tail, who had started out as a pet project of mine. I had spotted her in a small herd of horses on the ranch who were roaming free and rarely touched. And like a kid in a candy store, I had pointed my finger and told Harold that I wanted her. And his answer was a definite no. She is an outlaw. Apparently, they had tried to break her 2 years earlier, but Slippers had refused to yield to their cowboyish ways, and they had given up and let her go. I could be pretty persuasive, and she was brought in for me with strict instructions that no one else was to touch her. It did not take me long to be on her back, and while she was never an affectionate horse, she clearly accepted me as her human. She was a one-person horse and the most sensitive animal I had ever ridden, and to this day, the smoothest horse I have ever been on. I loved her, and besides Winterhawk, she became my principal riding horse while working on the ranch. Watching our relationship, Harold had come to the conclusion that if I could gentle Slippers, I would also be able to tame a wild horse. I was less certain, but being young and foolish and feeling pretty good about myself, I was certainly game to give it a try. While I was ready for the challenge, I was also deeply conflicted. Then, as now, I felt that wild horses belonged in the wild, and there was no way that in an unlikely event of her capture, I would abandon Redcap on the ranch once I had to leave again for Germany. So, I hatched an elaborate plan. Yes, I would have a go at gentling her, but once the time came for my departure in a few months, I would sneak out in the middle of the night, saddle Winterhawk, halter Redcap, blithely assuming that at the very least I would be able to halter train her, and pony her through the north gate of the ranch, where I would set her free. I felt quite a bit better after concocting this scheme. The day for our Wildy hunt had arrived. Note that there's no mention of a capture permit. Harold had decided that it would just be him and me on this venture. The plan was simple. Too simple, I thought. He had an approximate idea where the threesome used to hang out, an area which was in the general vicinity of a dilapidated corral hidden in the bush. Harold had sent a ranch hand to open and stabilize the gate, and we would try to chase Redcap into the corral. We were well mounted on two of the fastest horses of the ranch. I was riding Frosty, who besides Slippers is my favorite of all of Harold's horses. He was a tough, spicy little pinto who had lost the tips of his ears to a killing frost when he was just a baby. Harold was on Nietzsche, Sue Tina for Little Friend, who could have been Frosty's twin. We left early in the morning and made good time, as by midday we had found Redcap with her stallion and a third horse, fairly close to their expected location. Staying out of sight, we stopped for lunch and observed them for a while. Then we remounted, and the chase was on. To make a long story short, what followed was one of the wildest rides of my life. We snaked through trees at breakneck speed, jumping logs and ditches, our eyes always on the prize, Redcap. We actually succeeded in doing the impossible, namely separating Redcap from her companions and driving her to the corral, only to find the gate closed. Harold's man had not done his job. Redcap took one look at this contraption, whirled around, and literally flew off to rejoin her companions. To say Harold was furious would be an understatement. He raged and cursed so hard that he almost lost his teeth, which had happened before. I, on the other hand, was jubilant. The adrenaline was gone. I had never wanted her to be caught. In that moment, I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. Watching Harold's outburst, I quietly sat on Frosty, petting him and thanking him for having carried us through this wild ride in one piece, trying my best to hide my broad smile. What a neat adventure with the best possible outcome. Redcap was still free, and to my knowledge, she remained free, becoming even more elusive. Who could blame her? I wished her a long and happy life with Ridge Runner, and I never chased another wild horse. Many years later, wild horses were to become a very important part of my personal and professional life. And when that happened, they were truly calling me.
Thank you, Claudia, for sharing your story with us and allowing us to read it. And thank you so much for listening to the second and final part of my interview with Dr. Claudia Notzke on the Wildy West. It really means a lot to me to see people interested in this topic, and I genuinely do want to see these beautiful horses saved. A huge thank you to Claudia for allowing me to interview her in this episode, and a huge thank you to everyone else I was lucky enough to interview this season. If you want to help, there are a ton of different things you can do. If you live in Canada, you can write to your local member of parliament or directly to the Minister of Parks in Alberta. If you're not as comfortable doing that, you may wish to follow Help Alberta Wildy Society or HAWS on Facebook to get more involved and see what other things you can do. And of course, you can like, comment, or interact with this podcast. Every little bit truly does help, and it allows me to show tangible proof that people care. If you would be so kind as to share this with friends or family that you think might be interested in this topic, or who you think would want to help, I would really appreciate it. For any business inquiries, please contact us at thewildywest@gmail.com. Tune in next week as I talk about Todd Loewen, the Minister of Parks in Alberta, and what he has been doing for the wild horses. I'm your host, Chase McGoran, and thank you once again for listening to the Wildy West.